Hello, everyone. Welcome to SharePoint Power Hour. And yes, I know you can't see me. I guess my camera decided to play an April Fool's joke on me today, so that's fun. Today we're going to be having a discussion on SharePoint migration. So we have a couple folks on the call that are going to kind of be talking through some of that. So it'll be a really good discussion. As always, before I let everyone introduce themselves, if you have any questions, and this is definitely one of those power hours that'll be really, really good for you to submit questions as we talk through this. But go ahead and submit those on the Q&A tool. You can see that either on YouTube or if you're watching on Google+, you should see it there as well. Submit questions there, and then I will be looking for those as the discussion goes on today. So let's go ahead and I'll introduce myself really quickly since you can't see me. I am Joelle Farley. I am a SharePoint consultant at Rackspace. I've worked with SharePoint for about 6 or 7 years now, and I am based out of Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm actually currently helping a client with a very large migration, so this talk will definitely be relevant to me. All right, so let's go ahead and we'll go across. So Kevin, if you want to kind of go next and introduce yourself.
Certainly. My name is Kevin Hughes. I'm based out of Kansas City as a SharePoint architect at Rackspace. And apparently my camera is also on the fritz. Thank you, April Fools. My role here is to work with our clients to figure out how we can use SharePoint to help them with their business solutions.
All right, thanks, Kevin. And Ryan?
Hi, everybody. I'm Ryan Keller. Hopefully you all can see me today. I am the SharePoint branding guy on the team here, so my role on the team is, I'll probably guess, to make SharePoint a little less SharePointy and a little more like what the client wants it to look like.
Awesome. Stephen?
I am Stephen Wilson. I'm a admin specialist. I do a lot of the infrastructure and installation and migration discussions with our customers. So I do less of the business solutions kind of stuff normally than other people on the team, but for today's topic, the migration stuff I have quite a bit of experience with.
All right, Tanya?
Yes, I'm Tanya Kaiser, and I am the SharePoint administrator for our internal SharePoint farm here at Rackspace. So primarily I deal with, my customers happen to be other Rackers, a lot of end user, both training, education, adoption, and then just governance on the farm itself, process and policies. We are also going through a migration internally, so I'll be speaking to that, some of the things that I need to work through as well.
All right, awesome. And we have a very special guest, and I'll let him introduce himself. So Todd, you want to go ahead and tell us? I'm sure everybody knows who you are, but just go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm Todd Clint, and my video's not showing up either. You guys seen my video?
Yeah, we can see it.
Sweet. I'm Todd Clint, and I'm just here so I don't get fined.
Nice.
Too late for that joke. That's probably no. I'm Todd Clint. I'm a SharePoint guy here at Rackspace. I work with all these jokers, and I, like Steven, I do IT pro stuff. So I've done a SharePoint migration or two in my time, and so I've got many war stories. And I'm actually doing a migration talk at Ignite, the Microsoft Ignite thing here next month, and also at SharePoint Evolutions at the end of this month. So this is a good primer for me to find out what pain points people have so that I can mock them accordingly in my talk.
Awesome. All right, so Stephen, did you kind of want to, I don't know who wanted to kind of kick off the discussion?
I will kick off. So, as Todd said, this is a good opportunity for us to pick up some of the pain points that you guys are having. So this is a great session for you guys to have questions that we can sort of tackle in this discussion. I do have some things that we kind of tossed around ideas about the stuff that we could talk about as part of the session, just in case nobody's feeling talkative today. And probably the first point, and I actually left this out, like I made a list initially, and I left this out because I think a lot of people do leave it out. The first question is, why are you migrating this information? Sometimes you're migrating it because you need to move to different servers, or you're changing your domain. Sometimes you're upgrading and migrating at the same time. But those questions are essential parts of the migration strategy. Because if you're just migrating from 2010 to 2010 or 2013 to 2013, that takes a lot of problems out of the equation. But if you've decide to change versions, it adds a little complexity to things. And having a good reason for that complexity is probably a good strategy too. If you're on 2010, you're perfectly happy with it, you haven't read much about 2013, you don't have any features that you want to use, the question is, why are you going through the process? And really, even though we as IT professionals and Microsoft and everybody wants you to be on the latest version, sometimes that's not the only reason to do an upgrade. And when you do that upgrade to a new version, you really need to look at the new version and explore the new features. I worked with a customer a while ago who went from 2010 to 2013. They're a very tech-savvy company. They had done a lot of work with their intranet, and that's what they were using SharePoint for. But what they had done is they had created a line of icons at the top of the page that led to different sections of SharePoint. And when I showed them a new feature in 2013 called promoted links, they were like, "Oh, you're kidding me. Like, we did a whole custom thing for that, and this looks a lot like what we did and would have been so simple in comparison. And now we have this big custom piece here." So when you're going through the upgrade, really read up on it and find the features that you can use, or try and find ways that those features could benefit your company. Now, as far as the upgrade or the migrations or anything like that, you need to have a few bits of information. SharePoint typically not very good about skipping versions, so you can't jump from 2007 to 2013 without some extra piece involved. But natively, there's no way to do it unless you wash it through the version in between. So if you want to go from 2007 to 2013, you'll have to build a 2010 farm just long enough to push all your data through it. Then you can move it to 2013. For 2013, a lot of stuff can be moved that couldn't be moved previously from 2007 to 2010. A lot of stuff kind of got lost and had to be redone because of a switch in the way that we did service applications in the two versions. But now 2010 and 2013 have similar structures, and so you can move not just the content, which obviously everybody wants to move content, because the content is usually the thing that keeps you from losing your job. If you tell them like, "Oh, no, we can move everything except for the stuff that's actually in SharePoint," yeah, we're going to lose all that. That's a good way to start looking for another job. Another piece to research in, for example, 2010 to 2013, Office web applications that some of us have used in the past, where you can edit and create Office documents in the browser. In 2013, it can't be installed on the SharePoint farm. You have to have another server. So the hardware requirements of 2013 are higher. You have to have another server if you want to keep the Office web apps functionality. So those are things that you need to think about ahead of time. You can't even upgrade in place from 2010 to 2010, or 2007 to 2010. You could just install 2010 over it, and that would kind of paper over a lot of problems. You would get all the same solutions in place, all the stuff that you had done to your configurations would just carry over, and everything just sort of worked, hopefully. But in 2013, Microsoft made the decision not to allow that sort of migration where you just install the application over the old version. Because of that, you're probably going to need to get another server. You're going to have to migrate it no matter what you do. You can't just run an installer and then go on with your life. So all of those considerations are part of planning for this. And I know Tanya's got a few things about the planning steps a bit later, but I'm just sort of giving you an overview of some of the thought processes that maybe you should be going through with the migration. It's really easy to say, we just want to migrate. Like, we want to upgrade to the newest version, we want to get up to date, but there's a lot more to it than just having sort of, a vague desire. If you're going to be going from 2010 to 2010, you can move pretty much everything that is needed in SharePoint. So you can move your business data connectivity stuff, your managed metadata. You can move over your user profiles. You just leave the sync database behind. You can migrate over your search stuff without too much trouble from 2010 to 2010. Going to 2013, all of that stuff moves except for some of the search stuff gets lost because there's a big change in the way search works in 2013. But that's part of what I was talking about. Look at those changes, because there's a lot of stuff that can be done with the 2013 search that can't be with 2010. And that can keep you from having to do a lot of custom development. It can make a lot of custom development that you did in 2010 no longer necessary. So it may take longer for you to go through the process of analyzing how 2013 is going to work, but it will be worth it because you can get rid of the customization altogether. One of my favorite strategies, and in a lot of cases the only strategy I really recommend with a migration, because you have to have those two separate farms, do the whole migration kind of in secret. Use your nightly backups or custom backups, like do them in the morning or something, and go through the entire process and document all the problems that you have with it. Okay, so someone asked what sort of products would you need to move from 2010 in-house to an intranet 2013 online. So depending on what you mean by online, the answer could be a little bit different. With Rackspace, we have several different choices. So depending on what you went with, we might do it for you or at least do it in concert with you. If you're going with some hosted shared environments, things like Office 365, weirdly enough, Microsoft really, really wants you to use those new environments. They want you to go with SharePoint in the cloud, but they haven't really given you a whole lot of options from them to make that possible. So they go with third-party tools. Tanya will talk a little bit more about the third-party tools here in a minute, but I think overall, if you're going to be going to something like Office 365, there are a bunch of different options out there. I think Tanya may have a list of a few. But if you just do a quick internet search for SharePoint migration tools, you'll find a ton of them. And there are a bunch of different considerations for which one you may want to use, depending on the amount of data you have, how much modification you have. There are a lot of things to be aware of, though, when you're moving to something like Office 365. If you do have customizations, for example, a lot of those you may not be able to move. If they're in solution packages, they may not be something that you can apply in an online environment. Some of those things can be worked around by using what's called the app model in 2013, but there's really no way to tell without looking at each one of them and then looking at comparable functions in the app model. So unfortunately, that's going to take a lot of planning, and there's not going to be a ton of hands-on assistance from a lot of companies. A lot of companies offer the service, but they don't offer the migration. They don't offer any kind of expertise to assist with it. So you're just going to have to do the analysis on your own. Typically, though, it's just going to be some sort of third-party migration tool, and you're just going to be moving data to new locations. And if you've got those customizations, you may lose them altogether. So I wish I had a better answer for you there, Anne, but unfortunately it just depends on what environment you're going to and what you've done with your current environment in terms of customizations. Speaking of customizations, those are going to be something that you need to make sure that you have sort of an inventory of. One of our coworkers, Shane Young, probably one of the last things that I tell people. Shane wrote a little PowerShell script that will go through 2010, and it will dump out all of the solution packages, all the WSP files that are installed in the farm, and it'll put them in a folder so that you can move them over to your new server. You always want to have those backed up anyway, but we found a lot of people, they installed one and then they made a modification, then they made another modification, they made another modification, and they never saved the final version that they ended up putting on the server. They never put it, in a folder or, on a thumb drive or something. They just, sort of lost track of it. Well, by dumping out that stuff with PowerShell, so if anybody needs that link, just let me know and I can send it to you. But Shane's PowerShell script, it's like 2 lines long, and it'll just pull them out of the system and dump them into a folder for you. You need an inventory of all those customizations, though, because even though you can migrate with with third-party tools, there are a lot of different things to consider that may complicate that depending on what you want to do. I found that with 2013, a lot of people are taking it as an opportunity to clean up their data. They've been running, they ran 2003, 2007, 2010, and now that they have to put it on a new farm, they have to do a real migration, they can't install over the current one. Yay, Shane. I will...
Let's not let the Shane stuff get that guy. No.
It may be the last useful thing he did, so don't yay him too much. So, I think that a lot of people have just sort of done those in-place upgrades, and they've sort of rolled through the installations of new versions of SharePoint without restructuring their data, and now they're starting to look at the things that maybe they did wrong for the last 7 to 10 years, and migrating a large list with attachments to another on-prem environment. Are there any free options for migrating the list with all the attached files? So yes, Sean, I mean the free option is to just migrate the database as is. So if you just want to move the list, I'm trying to think if there are any free options. I know there is a content migration tool on Codeplex. I cannot remember the name of it right now, but there is one that would allow you to maybe do that. Someone else is saying planning analysis. No, just go for it. Ramming speed, as they say. I actually do recommend that for the test. So when I said, to do the test version first, the test will scare you to death. Like you'll go through and there's a PowerShell command called test SP content database, and you check and see what all the exceptions are, and sometimes you'll run that and you'll have like 5 pages of things that didn't come over correctly, or they're in the old system that aren't in the new system yet, and any of them that you can solve easily. Like if it says you need to install this package, or you're missing this image in this folder, you just copy it from the old server and put it on the new one. But if it just says like this long alphanumeric string is missing, and you have no idea what that long alphanumeric string is, sometimes it's just something that was installed in 2010, and then you uninstalled it, or you never used it, and it left a mark in the database. And so the database is saying, this used to be in this farm, it's not in this farm, but it won't actually cause a problem. So I do recommend ramming speed when it comes to the first test. You just go through all of the errors, convert everything to 2013, and then you go and look at the content, see how bad it is, because sometimes it comes over much better than you think it will. And I've had several migrations go that way, where I thought it was going to be really, really horrible. We installed all the solution packages that they had available, we migrated everything, and it's like, well, son of a gun, that actually worked. So yes, for the first test, I really do recommend just charging through any error that doesn't stop you. If it just says, there's something wrong here, just be like, that's nice. Let's move on.
Can I jump in here quick?
Jump in.
All right, so I think the tool that you were thinking about on CodePlex is spdeploymentwizard.codeplex.com.
Mm-hmm.
And that's written by a guy named Chris O'Brien. He's if he's not still, he used to be a longtime SharePoint MVP, a guy from the UK. And I've used that. He's had that out there for a while. And it uses the content deployment API. So it's the same kind of stuff if you were to go out to PowerShell and do, export SPWeb, import SPWeb. It's the same kind of stuff. That is just content. So you're going to lose alerts and workflows and all that stuff that's not content. So, that's a good one to test. It's a good tool, a good one-off tool. I've used it. I want to back up some of the things that Steven said. One of my mantras when I do upgrades is don't upgrade crap. And so when Stephen talked about, a lot of places use this as an opportunity to right some of the sins of the past, that's a very common thing. So it gives you a good opportunity to look and see if you really need those Excel documents from 1996, the kitchen schedules and all that. Probably don't need that. And it gives you an opportunity to kind of fix your architecture, fix your governance, and what all those buzzwords are. So when you pick the tools that are out there, the AvePoints and the ShareGates and all that kind of stuff, you can say, take this little chunk of this site collection and make it a new site collection, and take all these other site collections and put them all into one. It lets you align how SharePoint looks with how you're actually using it now.
And that's when I was a new, SharePoint consultant. I hadn't done a lot of stuff. I kind of had that, just do it. Like, you guys are talking me to death, like, death by committee and, governance, blah, 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 blah. And I just wanted to get it done. But over time, you learn some of that stuff can save you a ton of effort in the future. And I often tell customers, like, sure, I can do your migration. I can do your migration in, 3-4 days, a week, something like that. And you may feel like, hiring me to do it saves you a bunch of time because you'd have to do all the research and you'd have to learn all the stuff about the migration. But hiring someone like Joelle or Kevin who can go through that content with you and say, maybe you should move this around. Here's how you should reorganize it. This is what you should be doing with your permissions. That kind of advice. It may take longer than the migration itself, and it'll be more difficult to realign everything. But once you do, it'll pay off in spades for years to come. Because one of the most common issues we have when we do a migration is people are like, well, we want to migrate all this content, but, is there a way to only migrate the good stuff? And it's like, not natively, no. Like, that's when we have to get third-party tools involved. It's not easy to fix all those things. But that's another reason for that kind of parallel migration or upgrade path that I was talking about, where you build the new farm and you do it all in the background. While everyone's still using the original, you move everything over to your new farm by using nightly backups and things like that. And you can go ahead and test everything that you want to do. And you can start, reorganizing your content, and you can take notes, all while they're still using the original farm. You're not disrupting anyone. And then once you kind of have a plan, you document everything, you write it all up. Site columns and site templates. When you're doing a regular migration, someone asked a question about the site columns and templates.
Stephen, can I jump in for a second? For folks that are watching on YouTube, they can't see the question, so can you repeat the question before you give the answer? That way they don't have to make up a question like, how many fish can ride a bicycle or something.
So it says, what about site columns and site templates? If you're just doing a regular content migration and you're migrating the databases, all that stuff comes over. So it's not really an issue unless you're trying to do things piece by piece. So Todd mentioned the deployment wizard and how it used exports and imports of the sites or the webs. When you do that, you lose some data. But if you back up an entire site collection, you can move it to another farm of the same version without losing any of the security, without losing any of the metadata. Well, the same thing happens when you move the database. You're moving everything over. The only things that you'll lose in that sort of migration are things that are in the file system of the SharePoint servers, like where you've gone in and you've edited config files, or you've dropped like images and things like that into the files on the SharePoint server. But anything that's in the database moves over to the new farm as part of the process. So you don't lose any of that stuff. It can cause problems when you use templates that don't exist anymore. So you always want to make sure that the templates that you're using are something that you have a copy of. And in the past, there was one type called the Fab 40 templates, and those things have haunted us for years because they came out for 2007. They didn't have comparable versions in 2010, and people just kept applying them and moving them over. That sort of thing you have to be careful about. The easiest way to do a migration of templates, if you're not sure if they're going to work in the new version, is to create a blank site with that template and just put it in your content. Say you're in 2010, you create a blank site with the template. Then when you migrate over the database, you save the template after you've converted it over to 2013, and now you have a 2013 version of the template, and begin using that from now on. The other question we had was what goes and what doesn't go, and unfortunately that's a business question. So anything that is in the libraries, the lists, anything in the content database of SharePoint, which if a user put it into SharePoint, it's in the content database. The only people who can put things somewhere else are administrators. So anything the users upload, it's in the content databases. Now, what should go? The question is a little more complicated because, like Todd said, do you really need those Excel files from 1999? My wife works at a police department, and they have retention records where they have to keep certain things for 80 years. So in that case, you might need to keep some of it, or at least hard copies of it. But you don't necessarily need to keep it in SharePoint. And you probably don't need to keep it in the same content with everything else. So that's why you need governance plans that say, you know, after this amount of time, we can move this data into an archive somewhere. And we can back it up onto a physical volume somewhere, or we can put it in just a separate site collection that is an archive site collection. So the current content is the content that people use every day, and then the archive is anything that's 5 years or older. But it's always a business question. You have to talk to your legal people, you have to ask your stakeholders, and you have to say, well, what do you need? What is the liability of losing some of that information? What are your legal requirements? Did I say alerts and someone said you said alerts and workflows don't go?
That was me.
Oh.
That was if you
can blame that on Todd.
Yes, that's all my fault. And that was not an April Fool's joke. Alerts and workflows really don't go if you use content migration. So content migration is something that started in SharePoint 2007 and has limped along through versions of SharePoint. Like the name says, it's content migration. So if you use Chris O'Brien's content migration wizard, it's to migrate content. And the idea for it, though it never really took off, was that you would have a SharePoint farm internally where you would author things, press releases and bios of Stephen as he's herding cats and things like that. And then you'd use content deployment to push that out to a public website. But obviously on the public side, you don't need alerts and workflows, and you don't need people to sign in and do stuff. So when you're using content deployment, if you see that anywhere, you're really only ever going to get content. If you use the other tools, they may or may not take workflows and alerts. Content deployment does not.
Right. So to clarify, Anne, if you move over the databases, the alerts and workflows do go.
Yes.
That leads to another thing that I've seen a lot of, and I want to warn everybody against. If you've got a SharePoint farm that everyone is using, and it's called, portal.company.com, I really recommend against the new version being portal2013.company.com. Try not to change the URL that you're going to, even though the temptation is there because you want to have both of them up. Don't forget Shane's cows. I don't know how that applies
I
to
have
the
no
migration.
idea who this Shane person is. I think I heard a rumor that Shane was leaving Rackspace. He was going to go to IBM and work on Lotus Notes. That's the word on the street, and I completely support that. If that's his endeavor, Godspeed to this Shane character that keeps popping up.
Little known fact: Shane used to be a Lotus Notes administrator.
So the circle's coming back around then. Good. Excellent.
So if you're going to go to a new farm, try and keep the same URLs, because if you don't, that can mess up things like alerts. Sometimes it can mess up custom development, and sometimes it just messes up things because when they uploaded an image or something and they link to it somewhere in the content, they link to it with what we call a static URL. They put http://portal.company.com/ name of the library, name of the file. They could have just put the slash and it would have assumed the rest of it, and they'd be okay because it's called a relative link and it just assumes the name of the server. But if they didn't and they use that absolute URL, that will cause you problems in the migration. So try to stick with the same URLs during the migration. You can create another name using the alternate access mappings, and call it, portaltest.company.com or whatever. But when you do the final step, you want to have the same URL that everybody always used before.
Yeah, I got a couple funny stories about that. So one thing, to piggyback on what Steven said, when you're building your thing, build it with the correct URL. So build it with portal.whatever, and then use an AAM and call it test whatever. So that all is good. But Microsoft, when they were upgrading internally from SharePoint 2003 to SharePoint 2007, they did some stuff with the URLs. Now, for those of us who've been doing SharePoint for 100 years, SharePoint 2003 was also known as V2. It was the second version of SharePoint. So when they were testing all this, they had, msweb.microsoft.com portal, whatever, and they created the new one, the 2007 version with those names, and then renamed the old one to V2, because to us IT nerds, us propeller heads, that was V2 of SharePoint. But then as those links, when people would go someplace and get redirected, the users would see that V2 link in the URL, which is the old content, and they'd say, oh, it's version 2, it must be the new content. And they started copying those links, and then people would get stuck getting linked back to the old version of things. So like Steven said, be very careful with your URLs and try to think like a user when you're doing that, because it can get very confusing for them.
And one of the things that you will find, though, part of the cleanup that a lot of people are doing, for years, people have just been, using short names to get to stuff, so they just type HTTP SharePoint. 2013 makes that super hard to do. And so I've talked to a lot of customers, and they're like, can we just make an alternate access mapping so that people outside the company can use SharePoint.company.com and people inside can just type SharePoint? Really try to avoid that stuff. Ways that you can avoid it without doing an alternate access mapping, you can set up redirects, like if you're load balancers or your reverse proxy, or even in IIS, you can just create a site that redirects to the correct URL. So people can type just SharePoint, but then when it hits that in the browser, it'll say SharePoint.company.com, and you'll get the correct URL. So when they start emailing links around and when they start doing alerts and things like that, everybody's using the same URL, because Microsoft more and more is making it difficult to use those short names, and they're trying to get everybody to put everything behind SSL, even if it's internal only. So, did you have something there, Todd?
I did. So I've been preaching that for a while now, before it was cool, that you should always use a fully qualified domain name. So you shouldn't be using SharePoint, you should be using SharePoint.company.com. And people pushed back because their users pushed back. Users are cranky, users hate to type. as if we type URLs much these days anyway. But I remember having this talk 5 to 7 years ago and saying all the stuff that Stephen said, but if it's ever available externally, or if you ever need to do this, this, and this, and people are like, we will never do that. We will never make this available externally. It's the most important thing ever. Where are we at now, folks? Everything, you got to be able to get it on your iPad while you're watching your kids at soccer and all that. So, a long time ago, I got forced to read the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Anybody who's worked with me, it's obvious that none of it took. But one of those was to begin with the end in mind, and I like to do that with SharePoint URLs. So Steve and I just spent a bunch of time telling you not to change any of your URLs. So now I'm going to suggest that there might be a time when you may want to change your URL. If you've got some of these short URLs, start thinking about where you might be in 5 or 10 years. Like Stephen said, buy that certificate, throw it behind SSL, give it a fully qualified domain name. Microsoft, like Stephen said, is pushing us towards SSL. There are a bunch of things in the back end of SharePoint now that assume SSL, and you have to go out of your way to tell them you're not using SSL. And people think, well, it's all in my internal network, it's all safe. Is it? There's been stuff going on. So that's one reason to change URLs. And then, like Stephen said, IIS has a redirect module. So if all you're changing is the URL from HTTP SharePoint to https.sharepoint.company or .company.com, you can build into IIS, you can put an entry in that says, take everything that's HTTP SharePoint, rewrite it to HTTPS, and send it along its way. So it's not as terrible for your users as it sounds like it would be.
Someone noted in the questions that Stephen Covey, they say he's in the biz house. He wrote the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. One of the habits is to actually finish the book, which I think is where Todd fell down on things.
You make a strong argument for that.
I carried that book around for 6 months, and finally I told him, I was like, one of the habits is to finish the book. Like Todd said, we just told you not to change the URLs, and then we gave you the exception. So a lot of this stuff, there are exceptions to the rules. You do need to think about that final goal, and you need to think about the way things are going. I had a customer a couple years ago who we spent about an hour talking on the phone because they were concerned that their production farm and their test farm, they couldn't move stuff from production to test because the test farm was too small. And they were like, well, what can we do about that? And I was like, buy a hard drive. And they were like, well, I don't know. And can we just move over parts of the content, so that we can test patches? Can we do it in sections? And I was like, yeah, but the first time you do that, it's going to be so much work. You're going to be holding a charity fund drive out in the parking lot, doing car washes so that you can buy a hard drive, because it's just going to be easier in time. And then they were like, after about an hour, they were like, well, it's not really a problem now. We have enough content or space now. We're just afraid in 5 years we won't have content or size for the content on the test farm. And I'm like, in 5 years, my phone will have 4 terabytes. And I thought I was joking, but I saw just the other day like a phone that I think it takes an SD card or like a micro SD of 2 terabytes. So when you're planning for the future, don't panic. You don't have to be there tomorrow, but you have to see the end goal and you have to work towards it. That is one of the things that we try to get people to look at. I think Todd has to head out. Everybody wave to Todd.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for putting up with me. I'll have to crash this thing more often. It's kind of a good time.
Yeah, we enjoy it.
See you guys later.
Take care. So those are all the considerations in general that I kind of wanted to cover. There are a lot of details to the migration, and that becomes much more of a kind of an administrative talk. And I know a lot of the stuff that we're talking to the business users out there, a lot of you may have been like, well, that was administrator talk. I don't, but it gets much deeper than that. There are a lot of things to consider from the administrative side. And if anybody's interested, I'm more than happy to have that conversation with them. Let us know in the comments if you guys want to go into more, administrative details about this particular topic. But the real big things to think about are your business issues. It's not so much the technical concerns, it's what you're going to do with the data on the other side. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Tanya, because Tanya has been going through this with an internal migration on our side, and she's had to deal with a lot of those kinds of business concerns. So Tanya?
Yes, thanks, Stephen. So like I said at the beginning of Power Hour, I am the administrator for our internal farm. So in my role, I'm not a server administrator. I'm more, the admin for the farm as a whole. I deal with, a lot of the end user training, adoption, and then farm management and maintenance. So I work with all of our internal business units. And this is very similar to a lot of other large companies. We have multiple SharePoint environments. We're trying to get them all unified onto one farm, which is our 2013 farm. Anything other than 2013 we consider legacy. So, Stephen mentioned, one of your options is to, move and attach the database. We actually did that with our 2007 farm, and then now we're working on, the 2010 to 2013 migration. So we've used a lot of the different, different options that Stephen mentioned. We've attached a database. We're also using third-party tools just because of the nature of the content. And we're probably going to be doing another database attached future. We've got a pretty long roadmap for all of our migrations this year. But the key to getting it started was to have this timeline in. So this is where it really comes not from the tech skills, but more of the soft skills, the people skills, working with the users. It's always fun when you tell them you're going to have some downtime, and no matter what, there's still going to be downtime, and they're going to be forced to have some changes. You can do as much on the back end as you can, but sooner or later, those people who have really high use sites or they're power users, they're going to notice that change has happened, especially when they're moving from 2007 to 2013. There's a little bit of a change for them. So what was important for me was to really flesh out that timeline. Like, what are we realistically looking at? In my case, we're starting this in Q2, and it's going to go to probably, actually we started it in Q1, and it's going to go all the way through Q3. So that's, a 2 to 9 month process, and we're working within that, and knowing that, if something happens, business needs may dictate something else, and we take that through Q4. So because we essentially have 3 environments that we're moving into one, if it was a smaller environment or there were less issues, we may have, been able to shorten that up a bit. But you want to make sure that you account for all of the possible situations. So in my case, it was, the initial, move the database and attach it, we had downtime. And then we had maybe some maintenance on the farm that they were moving to accommodate that. Stephen mentioned Fab 40. If we had Fab 40 stuff, we had to go and look at those sites specifically and decide, are we going to try and move them? Do they need to stay? Culling through that SharePoint content of what you want to, get rid of is probably the biggest time consumer. In my case, I got to go meet with the users and say, well, I noticed you haven't touched anything on your SharePoint site in 4 or 5 years, but you tell me it can't be deleted. What's the business case here? Hitting those big sites that were sitting out there helped us kind of configure the timeline. We found stuff, that they're not really using it, but they use it as reference material. So they refer back to it all the time, even though the content is still static. And then once we had, the downtime planned and the maintenance windows planned, we also had to have a timeline for these database retentions. Once we move this stuff over to the new farm, we don't want to have these backups sitting here forever. So we had to decide, is it going to be 90 days? Is it going to be 180 days? Because if anything is wrong with that migration, once they're on the new site, we wanted to be able to roll back, but we had to put a stop to it. So in our case, we settled on 90 days because a lot of this data is pretty old from the 2007 farm. Once you got the timeline, it's really good to get all of your key stakeholders. This is not just senior leaders or management, our IT support desk. It's important to include users on that so they can give you the feedback about the things that you want to change. One of the things that we heard from a lot of people is just simple functionality. We found out that a lot more of our users were still on older versions of Office than we thought. And we had to literally sit down with them and show them, like, let me show you the new things you're going to be able to do in 2013 and explain why you want to upgrade to 2013 and maybe also upgrade your Office versions. And once they saw it, they understood the functionality was going to be improved. So it was really important to include those key stakeholders. Once we got that, one thing that I really recommend for people who are running migrations, is to have your plan for different scenarios. So in our case, Stephen said there's always an exception for changing URLs. Make sure you know when are you going to make an exception as much as you can. Do what if planning. In this situation, is this going to be an exception? If somebody comes and they may be a senior leader and they want to escalate this, they need something restored. What is our response going to be? Because the minute everybody's on the same page, it's going to make your migration go smoother. It's kind of like not playing favorites. Like no matter who comes and says, I can't have downtime, it has to stay up, you have to find a way. I had to be able to say, no, we're really moving forward with this. It's going to happen. And the key to all of this is, again, just communicating out to everybody. So in my case, we had, some high-touch users and high-touch sites. I reached out to those teams specifically, let them know what the downtime was going to look like, what the roadmap was going to look like. And I wasn't budging on the downtime, but they knew that I was going to them directly, and that really helped smooth the process. They felt like they weren't just going to be blindsided, and that if they did have issues, they were going to be taken care of. A big thing with any migration, no matter how much you communicate, you're still going to have people who just completely ignored it. We didn't really know that documentation said this. We didn't know that email said this. So when that downtime is actually happening, it's really important to have somebody available. If in my case it's me, but it's also other key individuals like the service desk or the help support to be able to answer those questions. We created a whole fax so everybody could access that. And within 20 minutes of my migration starting, the one that I did a few weeks ago, I had calls on my cell phone asking what's going on. And I reminded users, remember when I called you and we set that meeting and I said there was going to be downtime? Yeah, we're in our migration window, so there's downtime. And more than one caller said, oh, okay, that's what you meant. Yes, that's what downtime means. Your site is in read-only and stuff. But just the fact that I was available kind of helped all of that. Like I mentioned, some things to consider about third-party tools. Stephen went into this a little bit. Out of the box, there's really limited options that you can do. We've definitely done the database attach, but we've also opted to use third-party tools. I know one person was asking what free tools are out there. Unfortunately, the fully fleshed out migration tools, that's one of the big cons. There's going to be a cost associated with it. But where you get the trade-off is you have a lot more flexibility in how you can perform this migration. So in my case, now that everybody's on the 2010 farm, we're really going through and culling the sites. I can use the migration tool to pull reports, what lists have more than 5,000 items that we need to take a closer look at when we move them over so they don't get hit with threshold limits which are in place on our 2013 farm. Or remove, people who are no longer in Active Directory. You can do a lot of cleanup with the migration tools before you actually do the migration, which was a big plus for us digging into this older content. You can do a lot of restructuring before you even move things. You can just combine it with the attached database, but in my case, we're using it to clean up a lot of items. So there's a few different migration tools out there. Again, if you just Google, you'll find a lot of them, but three of the big ones are AvePoint, Metalogix, and ShareGate. They all have different price structures. They all have different requirements, whether you install it on the server, on your client machine, or you have the option to do both. AvePoint and Metalogix both, have pricing based on how much data you're moving over. So if you have an old farm that you inherited, you may not be able to get a grasp on that. So that's sometimes, a big question mark that scares people away from a third-party tool. ShareGate is installed on your client, not the server. Does it have charges? So each of them, depending on what you're moving, is going to provide a better solution for you. And just like anything in SharePoint, it's going to be what meets your needs. One thing that we didn't mention, if you're doing sort of, inherited a farm or have no idea, is another tool that's just really useful for farm management is Docket. So you can run that on your farms to kind of get an idea of what is really set up on your farm. So that's not necessarily a migration tool. That's more just a farm management tool. But if you have access to that, that's something that you can do ahead of a migration. But the pros and cons for third-party tools, again, it is slower than just moving over a database. But like Stephen said, you use it more as a consultation tool. Dig through each site. What do we want to keep? What do we want to go? Do we want to, put governance in place? Because along with those migration pieces, they often have management pieces too with those tools. So I wouldn't throw them out just because of the cost. I'd take a hard look at them and see for that end goal, you want to get everything on one farm, or you want to get everything uniform, what else can you use that tool for other than the one-time migration? So in our case, we're definitely using both the migration piece and the management piece of the tools.
Someone asked a question, moving lists with versioning and auditing from SP 2010 in-house to SP 2013 online. Most of the third-party tools that Tanya mentioned can do that. So I know that Metalogix, AvePoint, and ShareGate, all three can move lists with versioning, and they can jump between different versions of SharePoint. That's also another advantage of those tools. If you have an older farm, 2007, 2003, and you want to go straight to 2013, you can migrate that content with a lot of your metadata intact across versions. So they do allow a lot more flexibility. And actually, if you think you have any kind of governance problem, I recommend the tools like Tanya said, even after the migration is done. You know, when you're thinking about how else you can use that tool, if it can, migrate, from one site collection to another, or a really common problem is you put all of your data in one single site collection, and you want to break it into multiple site collections so you can put it into more databases and everything. Those tools can do that sort of thing for you. They're not just for migrating from version to version. They are for moving content around, reorganizing content. So as much as, we use SharePoint out of the box all the time, and we really try to discourage people from putting too much customization in that's not necessary. Try and use the out of the box tools when you can. But if you can get a third-party tool for, in some cases they're only like a couple of $1,000. That seems like a lot, like, a couple $1,000 for any of us day to day. A lot of times it's like, that's a lot of money. But compared to consulting time, compared to staffing time, your own staff working on something for 2 or 3 weeks versus something that they can do in a few hours with a third-party tool, it may be worth the cost.
Yeah, and one thing that I do want to note is, like on our 2007 farm, the tool that we've opted to use right now is ShareGate. Certain sites that we wanted to upgrade right away, I could use that tool to go directly from 2007 to 2013, and then the other sites we move the database. A really complex one that I did had a ton of info path forms that were nested inside folders. They weren't using versioning, they were saving the forms themselves, and using the tool I was able to maintain the original authors, some of who are no longer with us. So we need to keep the original author because we need that audit trail, but they're not in Active Directory. I could map the properties, I could remove the folders, and I could map the info path form all with that tool, which was really powerful. We looked at out-of-the-box ways of doing that using workflows and moving it from a library to library, but every time a workflow is triggered, that's modifying the date. So to keep that document history intact, we really had to use a third-party tool. One big bonus for me is nobody wants me touching the servers, and digging into central admin directly. And with these third-party tools, I don't have to do that. So depending on what kind of staff you have running your SharePoint farms, that alone may be worth the cost of it. You can kind of leave your central admin and the servers themselves up to your engineers and your server administrators, but still let people manage a migration or manage governance with a third-party tool. They are really, really powerful, and they give you a lot of flexibility. And you can decide what you move over. If you don't care about keeping all the versions, you have the option not to keep those. If you have document IDs that you have to keep exactly the same, you've got that as well. But they're worth looking into. I think all of them, AvePoint, Metalogix, and ShareGate, have some version of a free trial. So it's worth at least putting it through its paces with a small migration scenario to like a blank site just to see what it does and how you like it. Of course, you're going to get all the company calls and stuff, but it's definitely worth trying them out if you're facing migrations and, or even big reorgs within your company where you have to combine sites and move things around.
Okay, I think we're nearing the end of our power hour here. Are there any other questions? And if you have questions but you can't really format them now, feel free to put them in the YouTube comments or contact some of us directly via email, and we can maybe give you some general advice. I mean, we're always open to any kind of consulting engagement, of course, but if you just have a quick question, we're happy to answer it via email. So any of those routes to get your information to us or from us, just let us know. All right, if we don't have any other questions or comments, I think we're done for the week. Everybody have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you next time.
Bye, guys.